So the first one we're going to start off with is more power is better. So we've seen a lot of people say and believe you need a bunch of power for drifting, and the more power you have, the better. This really is not necessarily true. I would say the biggest thing is power is relative to your grip level. So if you're just a grassroots driver and you're just staying on smaller tracks, second, third gear, and just having fun, probably be at a disadvantage. It's going to be harder to control on those tight tracks. So that 3 to even 250 to 400 horsepower level is going to be a lot better. Now, obviously, when you get into competition and pro cars and things like that, there are certain power levels that are more ideal, but even then, more power is not necessarily better. I think in Formula Drift and some of the other top professional drifting series, we've found those kind of peak power levels for what the sanctions allow within the rules. So if you look at the tires we're allowed to use as well as what we're allowed to modify on the chassis, really anything beyond 1200 horsepower is not usable unless you have an extremely heavy vehicle. It's good to start with a lower powered car, not low power. We'll get into that in a second, but definitely a low to mid horsepower car. That's going to be a lot better for you to learn, and it'll take you a really long ways. So don't go LS swapping and supercharging just quite yet. The next myth is lower power takes more skill. I'll say this, lower power is great for learning, but it doesn't necessarily take more skill. A lower powered car is better for when you're learning to drift. Too low of horsepower is actually going to be a disadvantage, so don't think that you can get in that AE86 with whatever those come with, 150 horsepower, whatever it is. It will be good on extremely small turns. On a lot of the tracks here in the United States, where we're running flat and they're big third and fourth gear tracks, it's going to suck. It's not going to work well. The latter half of that is that more power requires less skill, and it's a cheat. I'd say at a certain power level and skill that is true. So maybe when you're at that mid-range and you could either have 350 horsepower or 700. Yeah, 700, it's gonna be much easier to break the tires loose, hold those drifts. You can use power to cheat certain corners, where with that lower horsepowered car, you need to use more of the vehicle speed. But if you're doing it properly and you're advancing your grip level and your angle level and your vehicle speed with your power level, let's take that 700 horsepower car and put it on Achilles 123s or some other race tires with a Wise Fab kit, and now we're driving its ass off. It is a much harder car to drive. But if you gave that same car to a lower skilled driver, they wouldn't be able to drive it to its potential. Probably wouldn't be able to drive it really at all. They could probably do a burnout, but they wouldn't be bringing the car fast enough to even get to drift. Lower power does not mean you have more skill. You don't want grip. This is arguably the biggest myth of drifting. And this one's really interesting because this seems to be a common thread. People all over the place, people that don't even know what drifting is, that just go, oh yeah, that you really wouldn't want much grip for that, right? They just think in theory you wouldn't want any grip, which makes sense in a lot of ways. The problem is when you start doing, let's say, real drifting, and you're really trying to connect those corners and doing it with more speed and maybe even adding more power and more angle, you need to up those grip levels with all those things. If you were to maintain that same super low grip level, the car's just going to spin out. Grip is really relative to your power level and the build of the car, as well as what you're using it for. And even at low horsepower cars, even like our Lexus, our GS300, which is 250 horsepower, we could definitely loosen that thing up more. And this is something to consider for a lot of you guys that are getting into it. Where we have it set is ideal for that power level. You still need to put some effort into that flick, and you really need to get on power to maintain that drift. You can't daily drive a welded diff. This is another kind of funny common myth. People are like, I don't want to weld my diff, then my car is just undrivable. It's not, okay? It's gonna chirp. It's annoying, but it's totally drivable. It's not gonna add a bunch of tire wear. You can totally daily drive a welded diff. The one thing I would say, think about having, if you can, having a daily driver and a drift car. Try to separate those two vehicles if you can. But if you don't want to or you can't, no worries, you can still daily drive, no problem on a welded diff. You have to have an angle kit to drift. This is completely untrue. One thing I will precurse this with, though, is it does help. And certain cars do come from the factory with extremely low angle. One, for example, was the Genesis Coupe. That thing has no angle from the factory. When I was learning to drift, it did make it much harder to learn. After we put in just some rack offset spacers and shaved the bump stops, it made a massive difference. Now that I've gone back, have a lot more skill than I did, I can pretty much drift any vehicle. I want to flex on you guys, but no. You don't need an angle kit. It's definitely a great addition though. You don't need wise fab right off the bat, as awesome as it is. I would still recommend getting some type of angle kit. You can't drift an automatic transmission. We actually did a video on this. I'll throw that up here for you guys to check it out. You totally can drift an automatic transmission. They're gonna do wonky stuff on you. It's actually kind of a fun experience, to be honest. Kind of makes you do some different things with the vehicle, and you kind of have to work around what the computer is trying to do with the transmission. But that is definitely doable, and especially with newer vehicles that have paddle shifters and Tiptronics, and they're more of a manual auto clutch, let's say. Those are going to be in an even better situation and are definitely driftable. So yes, you can drift automatics. Slightly different skill set, but it's definitely doable. Yeah. Pro drift cars require less driver skill. I'd say specifically Formula Drift. You'll see this comment randomly in the live streams of Formula Drift events, just talking to people at grassroots events. It's so not true. It's out of control. The one thing I will say before we break it down is at a certain power level with certain modifications, let's say wise fab and 600 horsepower, which is not a pro drift car, these cars are built specifically to go as fast as possible, hold as much angle as possible, and be on the door of another car. Sometimes that speeds over 110 miles per hour. That takes the utmost driver skill, okay? Those type of cars and those drivers, that is not cheating at all. It doesn't take less driver skill, because I can tell you, being a professional and having 2 pro drift cars now, driving multiple pro drift cars, they're tremendously harder to drive. Even a super low powered A86, that's a breeze compared to a pro drift car. Have you ever gotten in a car and stepped on the throttle and pooped your pants or threw up all over yourself? No, you would have if you ever driven a pro car. Drifting is a race. Now this is different than saying drifting is racing or drifting is not racing. Nearly every type of drifting competition, it's not a race. It's actually 2 cars battling. They're doing tandem, as we like to call it. Quick rundown for those who aren't familiar with it. Starts out as a bracket. You qualify into that bracket, so you do a single judge run based on line angle and style. They place you into the bracket, and then you battle it out from a top 32 or a top 16 down to a final winner. They're not trying to get to the finish line first. Actually, they don't even judge off of speed anymore in most series. So in Formula Drift specifically, speed is really not, it's not measured, let's say, as well as your time is not measured. But generally, if you pass that lead car, you're gonna get 0 points. You're not trying to beat them in that way. Drifting is not a race. You can drift front wheel drive. Yes, you can slide it, but true drifting, we're throwing the car in, using the vehicle's inertia, and then using the power of the rear wheels to continue that slide forward and transitioning and basically doing that over and over again. That is not possible, because if you notice what I said, you use the rear tires to continue that slide and turn it into a drift basically. It's not drifting, it's super fun, but it truly is sliding or basically just messing around. You need a handbrake to drift. You do not need a handbrake to drift. I actually am a big proponent of not using the handbrake to drift until you can completely link a track and are actually a comfortable drifter. I really believe that there's a lot of skills you miss when you really rely on a handbrake for entering and extending corners. You miss out on those skills if you're relying on it. I think it's much better to learn without a handbrake and then add that in as a tool and not a crutch later on. Speaking of handbrakes, handbrake entries are the least cool way to enter. Feel free to flame. I'll wait. Go ahead. Feint entries, using your vehicle's speed is way cooler. Even throwing in a clutch kick with it, that's way more badass. There are circumstances, especially in Formula Drift, where the tracks are so fast, the way that they're built, maybe they're on a bank, certain things like that, where it requires a handbrake entry, and that's okay. I'm not saying that the other style of entry is better there, but generally, the big old flick, Scandinavian flick, feint entry, whatever you want to call it, I want to see more of that in America. Please guys, stop going 300 miles per hour and then holding your handbrake until you get to 40 miles per hour and then stomping on the throttle. It's not exciting. Nobody likes watching it. Anyways, that's it for today.